Everybody, this is Mr. Arvites. Look, we're at part 2 of the American Revolution. And so what we're going to do in this video, we're going to look at George Washington and how this guy kind of really carries the American army through. And the next videos, we're going to look at some other key figures and key events as well. So George Washington, in a lot of ways, look, he's not the best general in the world. He loses more battles than he wins. He makes a lot of bonehead mistakes, and we'll look at that in the Battle of New York. He loses that. He loses Brandywine Creek pretty epically. But at the same time, this is a guy who is going to end up holding the army together through kind of like almost sheer will, through his own kind of character. He's a high character individual. He has a lot of flaws as well, right? He's emotionally closed off. He has a chip on his shoulder because he's born into this aristocratic world of Virginia plantation owners, except he's kind of like a marginal son. He's not educated formally. And so he has a lot of shortcomings, at least in his own mind, as a result. And so George Washington is always going to be living with that. Now, let's kind of look at a little brief history of him, right? So George Washington wasn't the first son to inherit in his family. Actually, he had his dad died early and his two brothers both die early, and that's how he gets his actual land. The marriage that he ends up being in, right, with Mother Washington, is not one that is... this is producing children, right? She already had kids when they got married. And George treats those kids just like he would treat his own kids. But it's not one that, you think about like the Hamiltons where they have like 9 kids and everything like that. But they are very good partners to each other, and they tend to take care of each other and everything else. George is just kind of a strange guy. I don't know. It's kind of hard to put it. He learns a lot of the things that carry his whole life through a series of etiquette books that he reads. And these books talk about how to act in public. They're made for like British aristocrats. And when he reads these books, it talks about how you don't smile in public very much, though some people would argue that was because of his teeth. He also learns how to ballroom dance very well. He has extremely good posture. So there's a number of things that George Washington does extremely well from a social standpoint. He's a big guy, right? He's over 6 feet tall. Some people say he's 6'6". That's just not the case. He's probably about 6'1" or so. He's a fantastic horse rider, right? He rides horses. He became famous during the French and Indian War. And interestingly enough, it's not because he was a good leader in the French and Indian War. In a lot of ways, the first engagement of the actual war, he got his men surrounded and had to surrender. And he got in a lot of trouble for that. But George Washington, time and time again, puts himself in danger during the French and Indian War, and that's something that almost makes a legend out of him. He has horses shot from under him, and he gets up and rallies soldiers. He's definitely a hands-on commander, and that is something that's going to really resonate with his soldiers as we get through into the actual war itself. So George Washington goes to the Continental Congress meetings, and he dresses in a military uniform every day. He really does want this job, right, to be the commander-in-chief. When he's nominated by John Adams, who, by the way, did not ask him about this, just nominated him for this, he takes the job. And so here's George Washington, right? He's heading off to Boston because that's where the British are. They're in Boston, and they have the whole city. And George Washington gets to the militia surrounding Boston, and he thinks he's going to find like kind of a semi-orderly group, and they're not at all. They're spread out. He didn't even get stopped by guards when he was going in there. So it's like if I literally am a big guy on a giant horse, and I snuck through your line, so that's not very good. There are people sleeping on the ground, people without shoes. There are people who are drunk, and he does not like it. And he immediately begins to try and whip the army into shape. And that's something that he's going to spend the next 3 years doing. It's going to take a while. The American army is not what we would call a great army for a couple of years. It takes a little bit of time for that to happen. Well, in Boston, he gets kind of a legendary renown. And some of it's because of luck, and some of it's because of his own kind of sheer brilliance in this way. George Washington is often a general who makes very big plans, and they're complicated. And if the complications all work and everything goes according to plan, he wins. That doesn't always work in battlefields, but in the siege of Boston, it did. And it actually wasn't anything he did. It was because of something that happened a few hundred miles away at Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga in New York was seized by Benedict Arnold, right? Benedict Arnold, and they end up seizing a whole bunch of cannons from Ticonderoga, and they're going to tow these cannons all the way to Boston, where they're going to surround the city, which is entrenched by British soldiers, with these cannons. And actually, George Washington is planning this huge invasion of Boston but it doesn't happen because of weather, and the British end up leaving like the next day. And it's a good thing it didn't happen, because when George Washington gets into the city, he realizes that the whole city had been barricaded street by street. It would have been a bloodbath to fight house by house. They would have probably taken it, but at what cost, right? So George Washington, initial part of the war, is famous because look at that, we just liberated Boston, right? The start of the revolution, right? The home base of it has now been liberated. Well, these British soldiers retreat, they go off to Canada, and Washington is then going to kind of make his way back to the army and try and figure out how to make this an American army, because it's really not. It's a series of militias at this point. So throughout the next couple of months, George Washington receives word, essentially through spies, that the British are going to invade New York. They're going to assemble in Canada and then invade New York. So George Washington begins to defend the island of Manhattan, along with Long Island, and basically everywhere in and around New York. And this is a big part of what is going to make George Washington's career, I think, really important. Because New York is going to go horribly wrong. It's just not very good, right? The British, one, are bringing in a navy. Two, they're bringing in thousands of Hessian mercenaries. These are German mercenaries who are hired to fight, and they are brutal. They slaughter prisoners and all sorts of other stuff, which will actually help colonial enlistments. And so Washington is going to build his defenses in New York, except he's going to be duped in the middle of the battle. And I'm not going to get into the nuances of it, but essentially Washington is going to get flanked multiple times in the battle for New York, and he's going to retreat back, from Long Island. He'll retreat back into Manhattan, and his army almost gets captured. He ends up escaping off into New Jersey, and it's a huge embarrassment, right? From basically August through September, they just get their butts whooped. And the British begin to attack them. They kind of do a lot of like skirmishes and stuff like that. So George Washington has now lost the biggest battle of his life, and his army is crumbling. Now, what makes it even worse is that the militias and the army itself that had been assembled, because now we have semi-national army, they're on 1-year terms. So the soldiers, after 1 year, can leave. And so Washington, as 1776 begins to end, he really needs some help. And this is actually where his brilliance kind of comes in. There's going to be about a 2-week span where the American Revolution could have ended. And in that 2 weeks, George Washington and other people, because he's not the only person involved in this, are going to save the entire war effort. Okay? He's going to save the entire war effort. And the first stage of that is really going to be when George Washington starts to reform his war council. Washington is going to be really good at recognizing young talent throughout his time as general, and he's going to appoint younger people into positions of power. Guys like Alexander Hamilton come in 1777, Marquis de Lafayette, another very important person, comes in from France, and these guys are in their like early 20s when they arrive with Washington. So the big step that's going to happen is in December. Thomas Paine, once again, is going to save the country. He's going to write a book, a little tiny pamphlet. It's called The Crisis, right? The summer soldier and the springtime patriot will in this crisis shrink from service to their country. The Crisis is a kind of like making fun of the fair weather fan, and it talks about all the different atrocities that have been committed. In the Battle of Long Island, for instance, the Hessian soldiers who assaulted the Americans ended up killing around 150 prisoners. They just slaughtered them, and the British were even like, whoa, we didn't think that was going to happen, and they got pretty upset about it too. But either way, Thomas Paine writes this book, The Crisis, and George Washington is going to have it read to the army, right? We're going to read this to the army, but he also knows that they're in disarray, right? They've been retreating for the past, really 4 months, and they don't have any hope in sight. And so George Washington is going to try and make a little gamble here. And this is going to be where he really comes into his own, and this is an unconventional thing. George Washington is going to basically, he's going to plan a nighttime movement of his soldiers. He's going to move more than 5,000 soldiers across the Delaware River, obviously the famous painting. And this is the Battle of Trenton. And the Battle of Trenton, which is going to take place the day after Christmas, so December 26th. So imagine, it's Christmas Day, right? And a lot of the people have been celebrating and everything else. George Washington has fires lit where his camp is supposed to be. Well, they're going to march, 20 miles, and they are going to cross the Delaware River, which is partly frozen, right? They had some river guys who said they could do it, and George Washington, to his credit, gets on that beach, and he's one of the first guys to get across, which means he's exposed. If they knew they were coming, he would have been exposed to enemy fire, and he is going to march his soldiers. A lot of these guys are barefoot, and so during the march, George Washington starts to notice these bloody footprints that are going through the snow. And so here it is, this battered and bruised army, don't have uniforms, barely have enough ammunition to do anything. That's one of the crazy things, is that they struggle with ammunition so much. The colonial army doubled its ammunition when Boston was liberated. They only had about 25 rounds per soldier when they liberated Boston. So in the Battle of Trenton, they march across, and in the early morning, they are going to attack the Hessian soldiers who are encamped at Trenton. And they're going to capture around 100. They kill, wound 150, and it's a big victory for Washington. It's actually like the biggest victory he had. It's a few British soldiers, mostly German mercenaries. And this is a huge deal. And there's actually, in a lot of books don't talk about this, but there's actually a couple of other little engagements, small-time battles that take place right after that. But George Washington is going to slip away. Just where he gets this kind of foxy nickname by the British generals. And a week later, a little bit more than a week, about 2 weeks later, we're going to see another battle like this. 1 week later or so, right around New Year's, right, the British are going to try and attack the Americans at Trenton. George Washington is moving them away from Trenton while they think they're going there, and he's actually wheeling around again. And what they're going to do is they're going to have these large campfires, and they're going to actually have Hessian mercenaries, the guys they captured. They're going to liquor them up, sing Christmas songs, and they're going to have some soldiers who stay behind. And while those fires are burning and the British see them just relaxing, the British kind of relax themselves, but they're going to be marching 15 miles around, and they are going to attack the British encampment at Trenton, or at Princeton rather. And at Princeton, they are going to, attack the British, but the British actually end up rallying, and it's not as much of a surprise as the last one. And the British end up rallying and kind of fighting back. And George Washington really becomes legendary in his men's eyes, because at this point, as the Americans begin to retreat, Washington on this giant white horse, right? Big intimidating figure, begins to ride in front of his men and rally them. Will you fight with me? Yes, yes, yes. And they fire on. And he wins the Battle of Princeton. The British are dislodged from there. There's actually a great story about a British group that was inside of the actual university. And as the legend goes, Alexander Hamilton, who was a artillery officer at that time, sent cannonballs through the school that turned him down, by the way. And they hit pictures of King George in the hallway or something. It's kind of a funny story. But either way, George Washington is going to get these 2 victories. And they're not big victories. They're small victories. But they're 2 victories. And at a point where a lot of Americans were deserting and leaving the army, all of a sudden morale went with them. And George Washington at that point began to get re-enlistment. They re-enlisted over 90% of the people who were in the army for another year. And that's going to be the trick. And actually 1777, this next year, is going to be where George Washington actually figures out how to win this war. The war itself isn't going to be fought over territory. It's not a classic war of conquest. So George Washington is going to eventually realize that New York doesn't matter, though he fixates on it a little bit. And really, none of the cities matter. As long as the army is there, and as long as they can continue to supply the army, the British aren't going to win. And this mindset is going to end up being what really carries them throughout the next year. Now, before that happens, we're going to see a lot more setbacks. Okay, George Washington does not have a good year in 1777. The battles of Trenton and Princeton are great, but they lead to a horrible, horrible year for him. Now, meanwhile, while George Washington is kind of really trying to hold things together there, Ben Franklin is trying to work wonders in France. He wants the French to not only help out in the war, but declare war on the British. And that will eventually happen. But the French want to see signs that we're not just going to fall over and die. And these battles are really important for that. But there are some other things that are about to happen. The British are going to launch a two-pronged invasion now, and it gets fairly well known by April of 1777. You're going to have an invasion from the north, from Johnny Burgoyne, coming down from Canada. They're going to go through New York, and you're going to have the attacks from New York trying to take Philadelphia. And depending on how the colonists handle this will depend on if the French really give them anything. They will give them some weapons and stuff like that. And a lot of French nobles come to North America to be in the army, and they all want these appointments, and it makes Washington's job really difficult. Well, either way, Washington is going to start trying to really rebuild his army. He has a tough time with that because just there's a lack of funding. The Continental Congress doesn't have the ability to tax, and they can't conscript things. But one of the things that George Washington does in 1777 that's really important is he orders his men not to raid towns. Because that was what originally the thought process was. You just take the food and then maybe give people money back in the long run. And Washington doesn't let them do that. And this is going to allow them to gain more notoriety because the British are going to be doing things like that at times, where they're going to raise some villages and destroy them. And that creates a lot of animosity amongst the town people, right? So 1777 goes horrible for Washington. Because the British are going to try and take Philadelphia, and he'll fight a huge battle at Brandywine Creek. And really, the British are building up forces all summer, and then they begin to march. And Brandywine Creek is an interesting battle because Washington has numerical, if not superior, equal to numbers for the first time as the British. And he has the defensible position. He's on the other side of the creek. He's got elevation. He's got everything you need, except the British dupe him. They feint, which is a fake, right? They send Hessians through the crossing, and Washington thinks that's where the main attack is, but the main attack is actually coming 10 miles away, and the British are going to almost encircle him. He almost loses the whole army here, but they're going to end up circling around, crossing the creek 10 miles to the south, or east rather, and then they're going to sweep around from the north and attack Washington there. And Washington is going to narrowly escape Brandywine Creek. And it really is a hot mess for a lot of reasons. His generals don't do very well. Washington is not able to adapt on the fly, and the army is in disarray. And so as they retreat 15 miles away, the British now have a clear shot to Philadelphia. Now, Washington likes to try and politically make things seem better than they were. They obviously sent word to Philadelphia. That's where the Congress was. Hey, get out of Dodge. They're going to go to Baltimore. But Washington is going to have an even bigger problem. He now has to try and reinvigorate his soldiers. And so they're going to fight the British again a week later at Germantown. And Germantown is technically a loss for the Americans, but in a lot of ways, it's a win because it gets the British on the defensive and moves them into Philadelphia because they don't want to be harassed. But the British were actually amazed by this. They're like, he got this huge defeat at Brandywine Creek, and a week later he attacked us again, and that becomes an issue. And the British are going to end up parking it in Philadelphia. And this is a horrible, horrible event for Washington, right? He's lost the capital, he's lost New York. But the war still goes on because he still has the army. And that's when we start to see him figure this out. He doesn't have to win large battles. He doesn't have to, though he does want to politically. And he doesn't have to hold cities. It's the army. And this Fabian-type strategy, an unconventional war of attrition, is going to be what wins the American Revolution. Because, look, in these battles, you have like 500 Americans die here, 300 British die here. But all 300 of those British who die, right, their families back home are going to be asking, why are they fighting in this war? And that becomes the big issue, right? Washington is going to just wait the British out. It's not the most romantic style of warfare, but this Fabian strategy is going to be what works. Now, what really makes Washington's legend grow is going to be here at Valley Forge in 1777, 1778. Because Valley Forge, which is near Philadelphia, close enough to where the British know where he is, they know where they are. They're going to wait out the winter. And at Valley Forge, Washington's going to do a couple things. One, he inoculates his entire people. We talk about vaccinations, right? Mandatory vaccines, right, for smallpox. Now, that was a slightly different way of doing it. They didn't have shots at that point. You're getting an infected part of the virus, pus from this pox going into your skin through a cut. But he inoculated his entire army. That saves a lot of people from getting sick. But Valley Forge was horrible. They ran increasingly low on food. They ate these things called hot cakes, which are like these really disgusting, like flour mixed with sawdust and various other things to make it seem like they're eating stuff. And so the average soldier loses something around like 8% to 10% of their body mass. Right? They're losing a lot of weight, and they get hit by blizzards. But Washington still manages to do a few things. One, he's going to put himself in the middle of the camp, which is really important. He also has the soldiers build log cabins together, and they divide them up into units, and they build this whole city of log cabins. And that brings a lot of camaraderie in there. It's also at Valley Forge where George Washington is going to get introduced to a guy who's really going to help save the war, and someone I'm going to talk about in a different setting, and that is Baron Frederick von Steuben. Baron Frederick von Steuben is from Prussia. He served with Frederick the Great. He claims to be a general because Ben Franklin told him that would get him to Washington. He's not a general, but he will be in the American army. And Steuben is going to end up training the American army. And so as winter at Valley Forge, dies down, and they start getting more food readily available by February. In March and April, Steuben is going to train these soldiers. And the way they do the training is actually really remarkable. At first, he trains like a private guard. It's 100 soldiers, really, really good soldiers. And it looks really good. Steuben writes about this. American soldiers had never used a bayonet before. It's kind of crazy, right? Never used a bayonet. They used it for cooking. They didn't use it for fighting. And the British would charge at them with bayonets, right? These long knives at the end of their guns, right? And they would stab them and they would run. Well, teaching them how to use that was really important. Teaching them how to march in rhythm was important. Teaching them how to fire under duress and not leave the scene of battle was really important. And so Steuben's going to drill these things in. He also begins to write the Little Blue Book, which is a U.S. field manual. And it's going to be the field manual all the way up until right before the Civil War in the 1860s. So Steuben is then going to train 100 more soldiers, and each of these soldiers under his tutelage is going to train 100 soldiers each. And so they're going to train 10,000 soldiers in the matter of about 10 weeks. Okay, and so all of a sudden, the American army is looking a lot better. There's a couple of other things happening. France has sent over weapons and ammunition because of a huge victory in the North. In October of 1777, right before this occurred, in New York, the Battle of Saratoga was fought, where the Americans defeated a British army and captured all 9,000 soldiers. And that was a huge deal. No one thought it was possible. Johnny Burgoyne's invasion from the north completely fails. And it creates a political maelstrom for Washington because Horatio Gates, the victorious general, really wants Washington's job. But either way, that big victory brought France into the war and brought French supplies into the war. So the American army is now getting fresh supplies. It now has some fresh ideas. And you've got this new General von Steuben who ends up... Washington's character doesn't end there. He lives with his soldiers. He sleeps with his soldiers. The idea that he is in and around them at Valley Forge endears him to his men, right? They see him suffering just as they suffer. Though, look, he's eating better food. His lodging is a little bit better. But still, he is always in and around the camp. And so George Washington, because he doesn't retreat, like some other generals did this. General Howe, for the British, he didn't live with his soldiers outside or in Philadelphia. He lived in a mansion with a mistress, and he was just very much entranced by Philadelphia. Washington, on the other hand, is hanging out with his men in the camp, right, at Valley Forge. Washington, though, is then going to, after all this, his unconventional nature, this is really what makes him, I think, in Americana. There's a big battle that's going to take place. It's called the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. And this is an important battle because what it essentially does is solidify George Washington's place in American history. In 1778, right, we got French help, we have French weapons, we have this momentum kind of building, and Washington is like, we need to attack the British now, right? We have to attack them. Almost all of his generals are like, no, we can't attack. That's a bad idea. Especially one guy named Charles Lee. Charles Lee had been really after George Washington's job for a while. He didn't like George Washington very much, and he really just was not a big fan, and he often bashed Washington through letters, and Lee is very much against this attack. So Washington, after meeting with Steuben's like, look, dude, I know all your generals are saying don't attack, but take it from somebody who served with Frederick the Great. When everybody else says don't attack, that means they're thinking the same thing. Let's attack. And Washington's going to take Steuben and Lafayette and Hamilton these three guys' advice, and he's going to launch the Battle of Monmouth. Now, the Battle of Monmouth is an interesting kind of thing. Washington's going to have a vanguard force. That's a forward force, about 4 to 5,000 soldiers, right, who are going to lure the British into fighting. And he's going to be in reserve with around 6,000 soldiers to kind of come in as the British engage. So the idea is that you get the British thinking there's a smaller force there, and you attack them, and they get overconfident, and then the larger force envelops them, maybe causing a surrender. He's got a very complex plan for this. None of it's going to go right, but either way. The Battle of Monmouth takes place on one of the hottest days in 1778. You're talking 95-degree heat, and people marching in these uniforms, right? They end up having to, some of the Americans, like literally their officers who are shirtless, riding their horses to get here. Some of the soldiers are not wearing pants, right? We must have looked pretty motley, I must say. But either way, the Battle of Monmouth, Charles Lee all of a sudden, the night before, is like, look, I really want to be the lead. So he comes up with 1,000 more soldiers, and he's going to take charge of the vanguard force, which was originally supposed to be led by Marquis de Lafayette. So Charles Lee is going to attack the British, right, or at least attempt to. We don't quite know what happened because all we know is within about 15 minutes, they're retreating, and they're in this full-fledged retreat. And Washington starts getting messages from people in the area that Americans are running and everything else, and they're on this nice little road, right? It's in farm country. You got these rolling hills and these nice little ditch roads. And so Washington sees these Americans come, what is going on? And then he sees Charles Lee on his horse riding off. And look, Washington didn't like Charles Lee. He knew he'd been bashing him, and he's going to use this time to just completely undress him. Washington never cursed in public. He didn't yell in public. This time he did. General Sullivan, who was there, said this was the greatest example of swearing he had ever heard. It was music to his ears because he didn't like Lee either. But Washington completely obliterates Lee, relieves him of command. Lee is actually going to get court-martialed for this later. But Washington is then going to start to rally the soldiers. And if you listen to accounts from the other people there, this battle was a mess. America was retreating. We were running away. The British are coming at us with bayonets fixed. And Washington, on his horse, begins to rally soldiers. And as Lafayette put it, he said, never has anyone ever done this. He had never seen somebody just by sheer will rally the soldiers around him to fight back. And Washington gets a group of them in front of him and says, will you fight with me? And of course they're like, yes, yes. And they all charge with him. And Washington's on a giant horse, by the way, who he could have got shot off that thing. Hamilton talks about it the same thing. He says bullets were flying all around the commander-in-chief's head, and he still just rallied his soldiers for support. The battle is going to be a grueling all-day affair. One of the longest battle, really, that George Washington has ever fought in the American Revolution is Monmouth Courthouse. And there's an instance that Hamilton talked about, and Lafayette, where a cannonball hits about 3 feet in front of them, and there's just mud flying everywhere, and Washington doesn't flinch. He just continues to give his orders with mud on his face and everything else. His horse dies from under him and everything else. And he still rallies them, and the British end up pulling back that night and move off the field. And then as night hits, the British, under darkness, are going to retreat from Monmouth and get back to New York. The British will claim they won. The Americans will claim they won. The reality is it's a win for George Washington. It's a complete political victory because the American army, which a year ago got owned, right, got completely destroyed at Brandywine Creek, and then a year before that got obliterated in Manhattan, stood toe-to-toe all day with the British. And the casualty numbers are like 450 dead for the Americans, around 500 to 600 dead for the British, about double or so captured and wounded. So from a number standpoint, it's a win, but from a political standpoint, it's an even bigger win. The British are now going to pull all the way back to New York in 1778. This is the last major battle George Washington is actually going to fight in the American Revolution until Yorktown. So until the final battle of the war, this is the last major one that he'll actually be in. The rest of it, the war's going to move south the next year. And this pulls the British out. And this is where George Washington's character is going to be cemented forever from this. He becomes a legend in the court of France. He becomes a legend in Prussia. He becomes a legend in Russia, and the Danes. Everyone loves George Washington now because of this. And all of a sudden, all those flaws that he had are overlooked. And it's going to be interesting to see how he carries on, because for the next couple of years, George Washington's sole principal job is going to be keeping that army together, keeping it trained, keeping it fed, and he'll do that, and that's how they win the American Revolution. Now, in the next video, we're going to be looking at how foreign powers and immigrants helped win the war, and then we'll look at Yorktown a little bit. Until next time, take it easy, guys.